We thought this was all about Russia and in getting involved in our election here. And we have this report now, this new indictment out, and it involves an associate, as he then was, not any longer, at Skadden over in London named van der Zwaan, and it all appears to deal with Ukraine. What has the Ukraine got to do with the Russians?
Well, it might not have anything to do with the Russian involvement in the indictment we just saw dropped the other day. What it does have to do with is the Manafort case, and that is exclusively on Ukrainian connections and monies that were being laundered from Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates into the U.S. So this specific individual falls under that umbrella. And the question is whether or not anything from the Manafort case, which is separate, can bleed into the Russian investigation. Now,
the charges did not come down just today, as I understand it. They're several days old and they've been under seal. It also is a criminal information. Does that indicate to you as a former prosecutor there might be a guilty plea coming down the pike?
That's exactly what it indicates. The only difference between an information and an indictment is that an indictment is brought by a grand jury. An information is by agreement. So the defendant didn't make the prosecutors go to a grand jury and get an indictment. It's an information, which is just a way, it's a vehicle to get into federal court, and 9.5 out of 10 times a plea agreement follows.
Does this push Manafort closer to a plea deal, and what would that look like?
You know, it's interesting. I think this is just another brick in the case. It's a very strong case against Mr. Manafort. They have overseas corporate records. They have overseas banking records. They have property records here in the U.S. Mr. Gates appears to be cooperating. So the case against Mr. Manafort is pretty strong. This most recent information or case against the individual may make it even stronger, but it's a tough one for Mr. Manafort to defend. And you have to look at an individual who I believe is 68 years old. He's looking at 10 years in prison. It doesn't matter where they send you. A 68-year-old man doesn't want to go to prison for anywhere near 10 years. So I think there's a lot of pressure on him to cop a plea.
After the Russian indictment, President Trump is saying that he has been vindicated on the Russia probe. Looking at the investigations and the different branches of the probe, would you say so?
It's just too early. I've seen the different pundits who have said that it exonerates him or it goes the other way. I don't think either is accurate. We don't know what Mr. Mueller knows, and that's exactly the way it should be. He's doing what he should be doing, certainly on the most recent Russian indictments, which shows how the Russian government, you have to say, was working to sow discontent. What is the next shoe to drop? We don't know. That may be it, or there may be other cases coming against the Trump campaign and officials there, or the Trump administration and officials there, perhaps lying to investigators. As we've seen, Mr. Mueller takes that very seriously, as evident by the case today. It's lying to an investigator and destroying evidence. It may have nothing to do with the Trump administration, but Mr. Mueller is clear that when his investigators come calling on you, you need to come clean.
This is a terribly important point, Jeffrey, because we in the media and other commentators rush to a judgment that it either implicates or exonerates, and in fact, we don't know. It doesn't do either at this point, as far as I can read the records. At the same time, there was talk earlier about the president being asked to do an interview with Mr. Mueller, and that seems to have died away. Do you expect that he at some point will give an interview?
It's an interesting question. It may have died away in the public, but it certainly hasn't died away amongst the lawyers. Sooner or later, something's going to happen. Either he's going to get interviewed by Mr. Mueller without any preconditions, or if push comes to shove, perhaps a grand jury subpoena. I think that's extreme. But I think one way or another, Mr. Mueller is going to want to talk to the president, and it's not going to be done by a simple question and answer. It's probably going to be done in person, and I imagine the lawyers are just figuring out the parameters of that interview. But I imagine the talks are certainly still going on.
And bearing in mind, we don't know the merits of this case, whatever they are, one way or the other. Does the fact that Mr. Mueller appears to be prepared to interview the president indicate to you something about the timing? That is to say, it's unlikely he's going to get more than one bite at that apple, and doesn't that come at the end of the investigation?
I think that's fair, maybe with a little cleanup along the way. But usually when you're putting these cases together, you start at the bottom. This is prosecution 101, and you work your way up. And obviously, the President of the United States is the top. That doesn't mean he's a target. It doesn't mean he's a subject of the investigation, but certainly someone that needs to be talked to. So once that interview happens, in whatever form it takes, you may have a little cleanup on documents or other re-interviews. but I think that may be nearing the end. And you have to say, in looking at this prosecution or Mueller investigation, it's proceeding at light speed. We're not getting any leaks from Mr. Mueller, which is not surprising, and he is going through and just following the evidence where it goes, and from at least my perch, without any preconceived notions.
From what you've seen so far with the different leaks and the different branches of the investigation, are you seeing any elements that could lead to an obstruction of justice charge against the president?
You know, that's very hard. I think legal minds differ about whether or not a president can even be indicted, but set that aside for a second. I think there are some data points which could lead a prosecutor to an obstruction charge, maybe not against the president, but if it's just an average individual, there might be a case. Whether or not a sitting president can be indicted, that's an open question. But I think even a objective observer would have to look at certain things done by this administration and say that's one point. May not be enough because we don't know what Mueller knows, but it's certainly an element of obstruction. There are individuals on the Mueller team that are specifically geared towards appellate argument and Supreme Court arguments, so this may be one of them.